applies to the mentoring of therapists who are no longer required to be in supervision, the kind of help to freelance practitioners that Giuseppe Leo mentioned, that they do in his area. It applies to therapists who are no longer required to be in supervision, but who seek to expand their knowledge and competence or to solve pressing clinical problems by sharing their work with an experienced colleague. I've been supervising students and consulting with colleagues since the mid-1970s and have had the benefit of many supervisors and consultants myself since that time. Notwithstanding all this experience, I had not intended to write a book about supervision. But in March of 2020, the COVID pandemic canceled all my plans to travel for various conferences and talks, stranding me at home with time on my hands. Shortly before the pandemic began, I had been asked by editors in the publishing department of the American Psychological Association to co-author a book on psychodynamic supervision. I had refused. I found that I could not accept their orienting premise. They wanted me to construe supervision as a matter of teaching specific clinical skills to be learned in a particular order. For example, the supervisor first teaches the supervisee how to express empathic understanding, and then how to validate the patient's feelings, and then how to identify resistances to change, and so on. Such a paradigm implicitly compares clinical supervision to teaching an athletic or musical skill. You begin with the basics, such as strengthening your muscles or practicing scales, and then you proceed in an orderly manner to increasingly more advanced abilities. One problem in applying this model to the clinical supervisory process is that newer therapists rarely begin their careers with easy patients who respond well to standard, more readily teachable clinical interventions. Beginning clinicians often need help, for example, to be less empathically validating than their textbooks suggest. They may need to learn how to set limits or confront primitive defenses or make a therapeutic alliance with the person who is paranoid enough to see the therapist not as a personal potential helper, but as a probable persecutor. I know of no way to change the reality that young clinicians inevitably find themselves trying to help highly challenging, complicated people, and therefore cannot be expected to progress in an incremental fashion from easier to more difficult interventions. In surgery, in contrast, new doctors begin their practice with easier surgical challenges, but there is no way to ensure that any patient in psychotherapy will be easy. Psychoanalytic institutes have tried for decades to ensure that their candidates start their training with patients who are so-called analyzable or good psychoanalytic cases, and yet their efforts have not protected their trainees against the discovery that they may be working with individuals with psychotic vulnerabilities, severe personality disorders, complex post-traumatic conditions, addictions, compulsions, family disasters, and other problems that may require interventions that go beyond standard psychotherapy techniques. For this reason, as well as because of the inherently holistic, individually oriented and developmentally sensitive nature of supervision and consultation, it became clear when I was considering the invitation from the American Psychological Association that I do not conceptualize the overall supervision process in terms of teaching a graduated, inherently evolving set of skills. So when I was sidelined by COVID and my friend Malin Fors in Norway suggested that I write a book that reflected my own conception of supervision and consultation, I immediately launched myself into that project. I realized that I wanted to write something integrated rather than from a particular psychoanalytic perspective. There are several good books already that teach relational supervision or classical supervision or self-psychological supervision or supervision with a particular subgroup of patients. For example, adolescents, people with substance use disorders, or dissociative patients. And I wanted to write a book that articulates more the ethos of the psychoanalytic clinical community, rather than the biases of the American Psychological Association, an organization that appears committed to the proposition that all aspects of psychological education should be quantifiable and measurable. In defiance of this assumption, good supervision seems to me to be one of the most subjective, individualized, indefinable, and unquantifiable processes there is. I am not saying that supervision should not be empirically studied. We need more research on the supervisory process. There is notably less empirical investigation of the outcomes of supervision than of the outcomes of psychotherapy. Valuable research can be done on the consequences of different approaches to teaching people how to be therapists. In fact, one of the pleasures of my preparing to write my book was immersing myself in the scant but fascinating research on clinical supervision, especially psychoanalytic supervision. Yet the supervisory process itself, much like the psychotherapy process itself, resists being deconstructed into a linear set of underlying elements. When I began reading the scholarly literature on the topic, I found that this resistance of the subject matter to being neatly dissected into its component skills had presented itself over many decades in the forms of three recurrent controversies about the nature of supervision. First, is it, in its essence, education, or is it a more advanced manifestation of a psychotherapy process? Second, does it involve teaching techniques or fostering overall professional growth? And third, is supervision a science or an art? It is interesting how many questions in our field become framed in the binary terms of competing or even mutually exclusive positions as either A or B rather than both A and B. Instead of trying to figure out which is the better conceptualization, I invite you to consider that good clinical supervision has elements of both education and treatment. That is, it can offer cognitive mastery and at the same time have a therapeutic impact on the supervisee. That it involves teaching specific techniques while also fostering overall maturational processes. And that it contains aspects of both science and art. The experience of clinical supervision comprises a whole that is somehow larger than the sum of its parts. Like psychotherapy, and like what Freud referred to as the other impossible professions, namely education and politics, The effectiveness of supervision and consultation depends heavily on the personalities and talents of the individuals participating in those activities. At least that is how I interpret the evidence. In preparing to write psychoanalytic supervision, I reflected on my own experiences as both supervisor and supervisee. I talked in depth with colleagues at all phases of their professional development, and I engaged with the scholarly literature on the topic, especially the psychoanalytic literature, both clinical and empirical. Today, I will bring up some concerns that have risen to the top of my consciousness about the complex and subtle enterprise of psychoanalytic supervision. First, let me give an overview of the book so that you have a context for what I will emphasize today. In Chapter 1, I offered a conceptualization of psychoanalytic supervision that aims to provide psychological support, promote honest engagement, offer information, teach skills, nourish ethical sensibilities, socialize supervisees into the norms of the psychoanalytic community, and stimulate ongoing curiosity. In Chapter 2, I covered some historical background, including the recurrent controversies that I've just mentioned about the basic nature of supervision. Perhaps the most significant and unifying feature of that history is that despite all the arguments that we've had about how to help people become better therapists, the psychoanalytic community is in profound agreement with Freud's position that the best preparation to be a psychoanalytic therapist is to undergo psychoanalytic therapy oneself, preferably long-term psychoanalysis conducted several times a week. Chapter 3 has elicited more positive reactions from readers than any other section of the book. In that chapter, I talk about how experienced supervisors teach newer colleagues to pay less attention to measurable changes in a patient's reported symptoms. That is often a standard for outcome research, but I believe that it's not the best criterion of clinical advancement. And more attention to the overall vital signs of therapeutic progress. In other words, supervisors need to help new therapists attend to indications that are more basic and meaningful than the symptom reduction measures that limited research protocols tend to use as evidence of psychotherapy outcome. Symptoms can temporarily worsen even as a patient's mental health is improving. For example, a person who is trying out a new, more adaptive behavior may temporarily show more rather than less anxiety. A person who is finally dealing with a grief that has been previously handled with denial may temporarily score on the Beck Depression Inventory as more depressed. I inferred the following vital signs from the vast clinical literature on what constitutes mental health or psychological wellness. They include 1, the gradual attainment of a sense of safety, eventually culminating in a more secure attachment style. 2, improvements in self and object constancy. 3, a growing sense of agency and self-efficacy. 4, a maturing self-esteem that is increasingly reliable and based on an increasingly realistic self-appraisal. 5, a strengthening of resilience, flexibility, and capacity to modulate affect, that is what the psychoanalytic community has called ego strength. 6, improvements in the capacity to reflect on the self and to mentalize the separate subjectivities of others. 7, a growing comfort in both individual self-advocacy and appropriate sacrifices on behalf of others. 8, a developing sense of inner vitality. And 9, an enhanced capacity to accept what cannot be changed, leading to a greater disposition toward both forgiveness and gratitude. I formulate a critical part of the supervisor's role as helping supervisees to note ways in which their patients are improving or failing to improve in the evolving confluence of all these areas, that is, in love, work, and play. In chapters 4 and 5, I explore some details of individual and group consultation and supervision, respectively. Chapter 6 covers the supervisor's role in teaching and exemplifying an ethical sensibility that goes beyond simple rule following and aims at increasing the capacity of the supervisee to make good clinical judgments and know when to get help with questions of ethics, an area in which students of therapies frequently appeal to their mentors for help. This chapter frames ethical issues and choices as dilemmas that are often complicated and challenging, and that sometimes admit of no unambiguously positive outcome. Chapter 7 explores the complications of supervising in psychoanalytic institutes, whose unique organizational cultures may foster idealization, devaluation, splitting, and paranoia, which often creates difficulties with boundaries, as Otto Kernberg and Douglas Kirstner, among others, have taught us. I make some recommendations aimed at preventing or ameliorating psychoanalytic cultures of enmeshment. Chapter 8 covers individual differences and the supervisory sensitivity and flexibility that they require. These include differences between the teaching style of the supervisor and the learning style of the supervisee, dissimilarities in the personality styles of the two parties, and disparities between them in areas such as power, age, gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, class, ability, resources, and other elements of their respective identities and social locations. The final chapter, chapter 9, is written directly to individuals who are being supervised, advising them on issues such as how to get the most learning out of any supervisory experience, how to address problems they feel are affecting their relationship with their supervisor, when to consider leaving an unsatisfactory supervision, and how to proceed if there is evidence that it is their own limitations that are creating difficulties with successive supervisors. This is a lot of territory, and beyond what I covered in the book, I keep learning from colleagues who have read it about their own experiences as both supervisors and supervisees. Today, I'd like to focus on what I have learned since I committed my original ideas to paper. I've organized these thoughts around 3 topics. Number 1, good supervisors monitor psychological vital signs in trainees as well as in their clients. Most readers have pointed out to me that as supervisors, we need to pay attention to the same vital signs in supervisees that we help these newer clinicians to notice in their patients. For example, we need to help our supervisees to develop realistic and reliable sources of self-esteem in their role as therapists. A number of colleagues have echoed my observations in the book that the superego directives of supervisors and supervisees, respectively, can lead them into misattunements in which the supervisee's self-esteem needlessly suffers. Specifically, supervisors may come to the mentoring relationship feeling that they should offer something, teach something, add something to the clinical repertoire of the supervisee. We all want to see ourselves as having something to give. Yet recipients of supervision, especially those who are new to the field, are often desperate to hear from a mentor that they were good enough, that what they said to the patient was not too far off the mark, that they will not be shamed for what they did not know, that they were up to the task and did not harm the client with their inexperience. Supervisors cannot take for granted that newer clinicians who are obviously caring, empathic, intelligent, and sensitive feel adequate or assume they are seen as adequate. If we move too quickly to suggest something different from or additional to what a therapist under our supervision did with a client, the supervisee is likely to suffer a painful sense of deflation. This is especially true for trainees with superior academic records who have no background in learning any other craft, that is, something like acting or playing an instrument or another artistic pursuit that shares the impossibility of perfection and the ongoing possibility of improvement, and in which there are always alternative ways to solve a problem. If until now they have usually gotten top grades, they can readily feel that any supervisory contribution intended to offer them alternative possibilities for intervention is an implicit criticism that they should have done better. This issue is addressable in the supervisory relationship. One of the things I learned from perusing the literature, especially the scholarly work of C.E. Watkins, Jr., is that there has been in our field a slow transition away from a tendency to try to teach a particular body of knowledge and toward an emphasis on building a collaborative relationship in which both parties work together on solving clinical problems. Watkins posits that the development of the learning alliance in supervision is as vital to supervisory outcome as the therapeutic alliance has proven to be in psychotherapy. It is interesting that both enterprises, supervision and psychotherapy, have evolved over time in the same direction. In both, process is acknowledged as more critical than content. Specifically, a good process makes possible the communication of content. In supervision, a good supervisory process is the prerequisite to the student's capacity and willingness to internalize what the supervisor teaches. I am thus arguing that there is a supervisory parallel to the psychoanalytic premise that considering overall vital signs of psychological maturation is more important for evaluating therapy outcome than measuring a patient's symptomatic fluctuations. In assessing the outcome of supervision, these vital signs of personal growth and increasing interpersonal competence in the supervisee are better indicators of the clinician's progress than whether he or she has learned to make what used to be called an ideal interpretation. People can be taught to speak their lines, but if their heart is not in the performance, the patient, like the audience for a play featuring an actor who phones it in, to use an American metaphor, will not be moved. Good supervision helps the supervisor speak authentically from the heart, often in integration with the gestalt of the textbook rather than from the textbook's literal claims. In response to that integration of emotion and intellect, personality and content, the patient is much more likely to be moved. Number 2, being humble and tentative is preferable to being confident and dogmatic. We supervisors need to be extremely careful in exerting our authority. Our supervisees may wrongly assume, and often wish, that we know more than they do about what is going on in any clinical situation. Yet we should keep in mind that in the supervisory role, we inevitably operate at one remove from the nonverbal, affective, clinical data in which they have been immersed. The supervisee has been in the room with the patient and has absorbed much more than we can understand from our more distant perspective. That distance is, in one way, quite valuable for supervisors, in that we can often see the patient's progress over the long term in the snapshots we get of each session. This is one reason that supervision can be easier to do than psychotherapy. We are a bit removed from the intensity of each moment. At the same time, however, our distance from the emotional intensity of the clinical moment can interfere with our judgment about what is possible therapeutically. The supervisee may have a better sense than we do of what the patient can tolerate without threat to the alliance. Furthermore, especially if we are overly confident, supervisees may be reluctant to challenge advice that is inconsistent with their clinical intuition. Their need to believe that we must know more than they do may interfere with their giving us data that does not confirm our ideas. Consequently, we should be careful not to be too authoritative. While researching my book, I learned that almost everyone in my professional community has a horror story about supervision. Experienced analysts who were trained 40 years ago still remember vividly every insensitive thing an early supervisor said. Many people have described to me how a mentor insisted that they say to a patient something that their own clinical intuition told them was a bad idea. They felt this conflict keenly, but they hesitated to bring up their feelings, either because they assumed that the supervisor must know more than they did about the case, or because they thought that stating a difference of opinion would injure the supervisor's narcissism, or because they did not want to seem uncooperative to a person who would be evaluating them. In addition, students may not yet fully appreciate the reality that the supervisor lacks some of the emotional context to which they are reacting. If the now experienced clinicians who told me their respective horror stories are representative, supervisees in this situation need to comply with the supervisor's advice. They tend to comply with the supervisor's advice, only to find that their own intuition had been correct. The patient did not tolerate the intervention well. Often I heard about patients who reacted by feeling wounded or unbearably shamed or enraged, and sometimes they left treatment. For example, I quote in the book a colleague whose supervisor was certain that her male patient was having an erotic transference to her that needed to be interpreted. Not only did my colleague not feel romantic vibes coming from this man, she also felt that if her supervisor was right that he was having such feelings, her premature exposure of them would cause a degree of mortification in the patient that he could not bear. When she acquiesced to her supervisor's insistent advice that she bring up her patient's putative sexual desire for her, this man felt deeply misunderstood and quit the treatment. One critical lesson that such stories teach us is that it is vital to the supervisory process to encourage students to express their misgivings to us, rather than simply to comply with our direction. Even when we are right, if they execute a plan that does not make intuitive sense to them, they will do it in a way that comes across as unintegrated and inauthentic to themselves and also to their patient. Recent research on supervision is only beginning to compile interview data on supervisees' responses to supervision. One of the more striking outcomes of such investigations is the finding that most supervisees keep secrets from their supervisors. They may be afraid of criticism, or they may feel that a supervisor is too narcissistically invested in a preferred narrative or theory to tolerate their calling that perspective into question. I was surprised by the number of comments by clinicians in studies of supervision to the effect that it was too risky to tell the truth. It may be a realistic concern for them that a supervisor is evaluating them as to whether they should advance in a program, but their inhibitions about showing their work to mentors seemed to go beyond a reasonable level of reluctance to expose possible mistakes. I was also surprised by how many students were privately critical of the ethics of their supervisor. They often mentioned what they saw as violations of boundaries in this context, which makes Giuseppe Leo's comments about boundaries quite pertinent. Number 3, the upcoming generation of therapists may need us to mentalize them better. Joyce Slockauer recently argued that schisms among psychoanalytic groups of differing theoretical orientations may be receding. She may be right that we are getting better these days at learning from people of divergent psychoanalytic perspectives. But I suspect that if she is right, it is not because estrangements and othering are disappearing from our discipline, but because the nature of our contemporary schisms is changing. The main chasm I see that currently separates some analysts from others involves age and years in the profession. Let me hasten to say that some of what I have to say on the topic of current age-related dynamics may be specific to the American experience. If so, I am eager to hear the reactions of others to my observations, as things may be considerably different in Italy and elsewhere. My own generation of American analysts grew up in a self-consciously affluent era. We could afford to think about more than our own survival. We expected to be able to change the world for the better. We were suspicious of conventionality and embraced the egalitarian, feminist, deconstructive, anti-authoritarian sensibilities of the 1960s and 1970s. We are now the older and often resented boomers, vulnerable to feeling uncomfortably outflanked on the left. Generational tensions were impossible to ignore at the meeting last April of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, that is Division 39 of the American Psychological Association, in New York City. The good news is that the conference abounded in early career therapists and graduate students, including people of all skin tones, sexualities, and identities. The organization's efforts to increase diversity were finally paying off, the outcome visible in full color. The bad news is that many senior members at the meeting felt invisible and devalued. Younger professionals presented data about their painful experiences of marginalization in analytic training institutes and graduate programs, accounts that it was difficult to hear, perhaps especially for those of us who have prided ourselves on being politically progressive and on the cutting edge of social movements. The fact that many panels were framed as manifestos provoked anxieties in the older crowd to the effect that in the next generation's earnest wish to develop a psychoanalysis focused on social justice issues, clinical psychoanalysis is receiving almost no attention. Last February at the American Psychoanalytic Association convention, I met with a committee on psychoanalytic supervision, whose members startled me when they agreed together that in their institutes, candidates no longer typically enter looking for mentors to idealize and emulate. The tendency of young analysts that Roy Schaefer described in 1979, that is, to make idols of elders who represent particular points of view that a candidate finds persuasive, is no longer much in evidence, they said. Instead, this generation of institute applicants was characterized as having an attitude something like, "Prove to me you have something to offer." Although the disappearance of the compulsion to idealize is not a bad thing, it can be painful for a supervisor to feel that instead of being treated as a wise elder, one is chronically being tested to see whether one is worthy of trust. It should probably not surprise us that this skepticism about what analysts have to offer has become widespread. It follows several decades of the devaluation of psychoanalysis by most American academic psychologists and many biological psychiatrists. But beyond these influences, this upcoming generation has for years witnessed a polarized and paralyzed politics, is enraged with their elders for allowing the planet to warm dangerously, faces an economic future much more imperiled than that of their parents, witnesses increasing uncontrolled gun violence and the frequent victory of corruption and greed over integrity and concern for the public good, and has suffered painfully from the pandemic. The COVID plague sucked many young people regressively back into their families of origin or left them isolated and lonely, deprived of communally meaningful developmental milestones and the social nourishment critical to adult identity elaboration. I believe it is the responsibility of older analysts to learn from younger ones about what it is like to come into our field now, and to appreciate that learning from the young, respectfully and with humility, is hard on our narcissism. In the United States, the past years have seen powerful youth movements aimed at deconstructing gender and depathologizing all minority sexualities. Large numbers of young people identify themselves as gender fluid or non-binary or trans. Many refuse to be designated by male or female pronouns, instead insisting that they be referred to by what once was the exclusively plural term, they. They have been successful to the point of influencing the style manual of the American Psychological Association to accept the singular use of they whenever a statement can refer to a person of any gender identification. I have heard a lot of grumbling about pronouns ever since participants in the 2019 spring meeting of Division 39 were politely asked to supply the labels by which they wanted to be identified. As you can see from my identification on this Zoom call, I've complied with this request. I can't help noticing inside myself a resentful response to these and related pressures. I am especially pained when I'm accused of committing a microaggression or behaving with insensitivity. The demands from people in this generation sometimes feel overwhelming. But then I remember how much I pressured my elders to refer to female colleagues as women rather than girls, and to use the term Ms. instead of specifying Miss or Mrs., and to call me Nancy McWilliams rather than Mrs. Carrie McWilliams. Many generations have made these kinds of demands on their predecessors, and I think we need to try to avoid defensiveness and not take their innovations personally. It is a hard discipline to be attuned and respectful, both inside and outside our clinical sessions. We who pride ourselves on our empathy with patients are not always as empathic with our colleagues. Several American professional listservs have devolved into orgies of othering, and the American Psychological Association has suffered a major rupture as the older analysts are confronted by younger, often angry colleagues. This upcoming generation expects nothing less than apocalypse and suffers from considerable privilege shame, both of which can be paralyzing. A young adult patient of one of my supervisees recently commented matter-of-factly, "I have no reason to save money." She and her age mates hope for change, but unlike those of us whose mid-20th century upbringing emphasized our potential and our anticipated social power, a fantasy that was often reinforced by the commercial interests of the time, young adults of this generation have trouble imagining how to exert any influence in this global, corporate, internet-shaming, bureaucratic maze of a world. They focus on what they can influence: use of language, habits of consumption, personal behavior, physical bodies. When existential threat underlies everything else in life, it is natural to disidentify with elders and seek a radical break with the past. If we elders want to avoid schisms, we need to let younger colleagues teach us how the world looks to them. We otherwise risk repeating the defensiveness of the ego psychologists in a previous generation when they encountered confrontations from Kleinians or Lacanians or self-psychologists or relational analysts. There are many aspects of supervision that I've not been able to touch on in a short talk like this. I am hoping that I covered them adequately in my book and that you'll consider reading it. In the meantime, let me summarize my main points today, which go beyond that book and integrate the feedback that I have been fortunate to get since its publication. First, we need as supervisors to pay attention not only to the notes that our supervisees are able to play on their therapeutic instrument, but also to the overall music that those notes create. In this music can be found themes and motifs that constitute the evidence of progress or the evidence of lack of progress that the supervisee is making toward increasingly fluid levels of integration of capacities that characterize and define all mental and emotional health. Second, we need to adopt an attitude of humility when socializing our newer colleagues to the demands of this strange profession. That attitude includes making every effort to open the door to their discomforts and disagreements with our recommendations. Third, we need to acknowledge that the world in which our younger supervisees have grown up is starkly different from the world in which their elders came of age. One consequence of this realization should be our appreciation of the fact that their ways of adapting to this newer world need to be empathically understood and respected rather than lamented or corrected. These three areas cover some of the more interesting realms of psychoanalytic supervision. They constitute a kind of wisdom that comes from both knowledge and experience, and yet I suspect that most psychoanalytic supervisors are already doing all the things that I'm recommending. We came into this field because we fell in love with more in-depth, complex ways of understanding human beings. We thought this perspective had the best chance of helping suffering people to heal from relational trauma and grow toward greater capacity. I'm arguing today that this perspective is also the best for helping our supervisees to become the best therapists they can be.